Love in the ashes of war. The rain hammered against the windows of the Red Cross station in London like bullets against steel. Lieutenant James, Jimmy, Holloway stood in the doorway, water dripping from his leather jacket, watching the nurses move between cots with practiced efficiency. He'd been shot down over the Channel 3 days ago, fished out by a British destroyer, and now he was supposed to rest. But rest felt like surrender. You planning to stand there all night, soldier, or are you going to let me close this door? Jimmy turned. The voice belonged to a woman in her mid-20s, auburn hair pinned back beneath a white cap, green eyes that seemed to see right through his carefully maintained composure. Her uniform was immaculate despite the chaos around them, and there was a small smudge of what looked like engine grease on her left cheek. Sorry, ma'am. Just getting my bearings. She raised an eyebrow. Ma'am? Do I look old enough to be a ma'am? She stepped past him and closed the door against the storm. Eleanor Brennan. Most people call me Ellie. You must be the fly boy they pulled from the drink. News travels fast. In a hospital? Always. She studied him with the clinical assessment of someone who'd seen too many damaged men. You're favoring your left side. Cracked ribs? 2. Maybe 3. Doc wasn't specific. Doctors never are. She gestured toward the main ward. Come on. I'll get you sorted. And before you protest, I've heard every excuse in the book. You're not fine, you're not ready to go back up there, and if you pass out on my floor, I'll be very irritated. Despite himself, Jimmy smiled. Can't have that. The ward smelled of antiseptic and damp wool. Rows of beds stretched into the dimness, each one occupied by someone's son or brother or father. Some slept. Others stared at the ceiling with eyes that had seen things Jimmy understood too well. He'd flown 23 missions. 23 times into hell and back. The odds were catching up. Ellie led him to a bed near the back, pulled the privacy curtain. Sit. Let me check those ribs. Really, I'm fine. Yes. I've established you're a terrible liar. Her fingers were gentle but firm as she examined his torso. He winced. Definitely 3 ribs. You're lucky it wasn't worse. Channel water this time of year. She trailed off, didn't need to finish. They both knew what the cold could do. How long have you been here? Jimmy asked, partly to distract himself from her touch, partly because he genuinely wanted to know. Since 42. Came over from Boston after Pearl Harbor. Figured I could do more good here than wrapping bandages in a stateside hospital. She stepped back, satisfied with her examination. You'll heal, but you need at least 2 weeks before you even think about flying. 2 weeks might as well be 2 years in this war. Then I guess you'd better find something to do with your time, Lieutenant. There was something in her eyes, a challenge, maybe, or an invitation. There's a pub down the street. The Hanging Judge. Terrible name, decent whiskey. I get off shift at 8. Jimmy blinked. Are you asking me out? I'm suggesting that if a certain American pilot happened to be at a certain pub at a certain time, and if a certain nurse happened to be there as well, we might share a drink and pretend the world isn't on fire for an hour or 2. She smiled, and it transformed her face. But if you'd rather lie here staring at the ceiling, that's fine too. The Hanging Judge. 8 o'clock. Maybe I'll see you there, fly boy. She disappeared through the curtain before he could respond, leaving him with the ghost of her touch and the first thing he'd looked forward to in months. The Hanging Judge was exactly as advertised. Terrible name, decent whiskey, and packed with servicemen trying to forget. Jimmy found a corner table, ordered 2 drinks on faith, and waited. The clock above the bar said 8:15. Maybe she'd been joking. Maybe she'd thought better of it. Maybe. Sorry I'm late. Emergency with a patient. Ellie slid into the seat across from him, still in her uniform but with her hair down now, cascading over her shoulders. Did you order for me? Took a guess. Whiskey neat. Perfect. She raised the glass. To surviving another day. To surviving another day. They drank. The whiskey burned in the best way. So, Boston. What part? Southie. My dad worked the docks, my mom ran a boarding house. 3 brothers, all in uniform. Tommy's in North Africa, Patrick's on a destroyer somewhere in the Pacific, and Sean. She paused, took another drink. Sean was at Normandy. June 6th. I'm sorry. Don't be. He went out the way he wanted, charging a machine gun nest so his squad could advance. Got a silver star for it. Her voice was steady, but Jimmy saw the grief beneath. That's why I'm here. Because they're all here, doing their part. Couldn't stay home baking cookies for the war effort. Your folks must be proud. Terrified, mostly. But yeah, proud too. She studied him over the rim of her glass. Your turn. Where's home? Santa Monica. Dad's an accountant, Mom teaches elementary school. One sister, younger, still in college. They wanted me to get a deferment, finish my engineering degree. I enlisted the day after Pearl. Let me guess. Always wanted to fly. Since I was 6 and saw a barnstormer at a county fair. Thought it was magic. He laughed softly. Turns out it's mostly terror and adrenaline. But you keep going up. Somebody has to. He met her eyes. Same reason you're here, I'd guess. They talked for 2 hours. The war faded into background noise, the distant rumble of engines overhead, the buzz of conversation around them, the occasional wail of sirens. For those 2 hours, they were just Jimmy and Ellie, 2 Americans a long way from home, finding something human in the middle of inhumanity. When the pub started closing, they walked back to the hospital through streets dark with blackout protocols. The rain had stopped, leaving the pavement slick and gleaming under the pale moon. I had a good time tonight, Ellie said as they reached the hospital entrance. Me too. Maybe we could do it again. Maybe. She turned to face him, and for a moment, he thought she might kiss him. Instead, she touched his cheek gently. Get some sleep, fly boy. Those ribs need healing. Yes, ma'am. Still not old enough for ma'am. She disappeared through the doors, leaving him standing in the darkness, smiling like an idiot. The next 2 weeks developed a rhythm. Jimmy would spend his mornings in physical therapy, afternoons reading or playing cards with other recuperating soldiers, and evenings at the Hanging Judge with Ellie. They talked about everything and nothing, childhood memories, favorite books, dreams for after the war. She told him about the bookshop she wanted to open in Boston. He described the plane he wanted to design, sleek and fast and safer than anything currently in the sky. They didn't talk about the war unless it forced itself into conversation. On the 10th day, Jimmy got cleared for light exercise. He found Ellie in the supply room, counting bandages with fierce concentration. Hey! Want to take a walk? Doctor's orders. I need to rebuild my stamina. She glanced up, a smile playing at her lips. Doctor's orders, huh? Which doctor? The one I bribed with chocolate from my last care package. Smart man. She marked her place in the inventory log. Give me 5 minutes to finish this. They walked through Regent's Park, navigating around bomb craters that had been filled in and marked with warning signs. The afternoon sun broke through the perpetual London clouds, painting everything gold. I got my orders today, Jimmy said quietly. Ellie stopped walking. When? 4 days. They're reassigning me to a squadron in East Anglia. Closer to Germany. He watched a pair of children playing near a pond, their laughter incongruous against the backdrop of sandbags and anti-aircraft guns. I'll be flying B-17s. Daylight raids? Those have the highest casualty rates. It wasn't a question. Yeah. They stood in silence. Somewhere overhead, a formation of Lancasters droned toward the continent, off to deliver death in the name of freedom. The philosophical contradiction didn't escape Jimmy. I don't want to waste the next 4 days being sad, Ellie said finally. Life's too short. This goddamn war's made it even shorter. What do you want to do? She turned to him, and the look in her eyes made his breath catch. I want to be with you. Really with you. No holding back because of what might happen tomorrow or next week or next month. She stepped closer. I want to stop being scared of feeling something good. Jimmy cupped her face in his hands. I'm terrified of you, you know. Terrified of caring this much about someone when every time I go up, I might not come back. Then we'll be terrified together. She kissed him, soft at first, then deeper, pouring months of loneliness and fear and desperate hope into that single moment of connection. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Jimmy rested his forehead against hers. I'm falling in love with you, Ellie Brennan. Good. Because I'm already there, Jimmy Holloway. The next 4 days blurred together in a haze of stolen moments. They walked through bomb-damaged streets holding hands. They danced in a tiny jazz club while a one-armed pianist played Stardust. They made love in her tiny apartment near the hospital, learning each other's bodies with the desperate intensity of people who knew time was a luxury they couldn't afford. On the last night, they lay tangled in her narrow bed, listening to the rain start up again outside. Promise me something, Ellie whispered against his chest. Anything. Promise me you'll come back. I know you can't control it, I know it's a stupid thing to ask, but promise me anyway. Jimmy pulled her closer. I promise I'll fight like hell to get back to you. That's the only promise I can make that means anything. Then that's enough. She kissed his jaw, his neck, his shoulder. Tell me about the plane you want to design. The one from after the war. So he did. He described the sleek fighter he'd sketched in his notebook, with innovations that would make it faster and safer. He talked about the small aircraft company he wanted to start, building planes for civilians, not war. He painted a picture of a future where they could be together without bombs and sirens, and the constant specter of death. Ellie listened, adding her own details: the bookshop she'd open near the beach, the apartment they'd share, the lazy Sundays with nothing more pressing than deciding which restaurant to visit for dinner. It was a fantasy. They both knew it. But in that moment, in that room, with the rain falling and their bodies intertwined, it felt possible. Jimmy's new squadron, the 351st Bomb Group, was based at Polebrook, a sprawling airfield in the English countryside. His B-17, nicknamed Ellie's Promise, was a beautiful beast: 4 engines, 13.50 caliber machine guns, and enough armor to maybe, possibly, bring him home. His crew was a mixed bag of veterans and green replacements. Co-pilot was Mickey Brennan, no relation to Ellie, but the coincidence felt like fate. Navigator was a quiet kid from Nebraska named Tom. Bombardier was a loud New Yorker called Sal who told inappropriate jokes at inappropriate times. The gunners were a rotating cast, some lasting 1 mission, some lasting 20. Their first mission together was Bremen, a port city critical to German U-boat operations. The briefing room buzzed with nervous energy as the mission commander pointed to the map. Expect heavy flak over the target. Intelligence says at least 60 anti-aircraft batteries. Fighter escort will take you most of the way, but you'll be on your own for the run. Questions? Jimmy had about 1,000. He asked none of them. They took off at dawn, 24 B-17s climbing into formation, each one carrying 10 men and 4,000 pounds of bombs. Jimmy focused on the instruments, on the rhythm of flight, trying not to think about Ellie back in London, trying not to calculate the odds. The Channel crossing was smooth. The French coast appeared like a dark smudge on the horizon. Then they were over occupied Europe, flying through airspace owned by people who wanted to kill them. The flak started 50 miles from Bremen. Black clouds of shrapnel bloomed around them, each one capable of tearing through aluminum and flesh with equal efficiency. A bomber to their left took a direct hit, disappeared in a ball of fire. Jimmy watched 10 men die in less than 2 seconds. Bandits, 3 o'clock high! Mickey's voice cracked with adrenaline. Focke-Wulf 190s dove through the formation, guns blazing. The B-17's defensive fire filled the air with tracers. Jimmy jinked and weaved, trying to throw off the fighter's aim while maintaining formation. One 190 came straight at them, cannons flashing. The windscreen starred with bullet impacts. Mickey screamed. Blood sprayed across the cockpit. Mickey! Mickey, talk to me! Jimmy fought the controls as the co-pilot slumped in his harness. I'm okay. Okay. Just wing me. Mickey pressed his hand against his shoulder, blood seeping through his fingers. Bomb bay doors open. Sal's voice from below. 30 seconds to target. The flak intensified, a solid wall of exploding steel. Another bomber fell out of formation, trailing smoke. Jimmy watched 6 parachutes blossom. 4 men didn't make it out. Bombs away! The B-17 lurched upward as 4,000 pounds dropped free. Jimmy banked hard, following the formation leader through the maelstrom. More fighters. More flak. The number 2 engine sputtered, died. They were losing altitude. Feather number 2! Jimmy called. Feathered! They limped across Germany on 3 engines, fighters snapping at their heels until the P-51 escorts reappeared over Belgium. By the time they crossed the channel, Mickey had passed out from blood loss, 2 gunners were dead, and Ellie's promise was more holes than airplane. Jimmy set her down at Polbrook on fumes, the landing gear collapsing on touchdown, th. Landing gear collapsing on touchdown, the fuselage grinding to a halt in a shower of sparks. He sat in the cockpit, hands shaking, unable to move. Around him, emergency crews swarmed the bomber, pulling out the wounded and the dead. That night, he wrote Ellie a letter. He didn't mention the mission, didn't describe the death. He just told her he loved her and counted the days until he could hold her again. He never sent it. Couldn't figure out how to explain that he'd made her a promise he wasn't sure he could keep. The missions blurred together. Schweinfurt. Regensburg. Berlin. Each one was a fresh descent into hell. Some days they lost nobody. Some days they lost half the squadron. Jimmy stopped learning the replacement crew's names. It hurt less that way. But he wrote Ellie every other day, and she wrote back just as faithfully. Her letters were lifelines, descriptions of patients who'd recovered, stories about the other nurses, dreams about after the war. She never asked about his missions, never pressed for details he couldn't give. She just reminded him why he needed to keep fighting. On his 15th mission, everything went wrong. They were hitting a ball-bearing factory in Schweinfurt, deep in Germany, barely within range. The entire 8th Air Force was committed, over 300 bombers, the largest raid yet mounted. The Germans knew they were coming. The fighter attacks started over Belgium. Wave after wave of 109s and 190s, more than Jimmy had ever seen. Bombers fell like burning leaves. By the time they reached the target, half the formation was gone. Ellie's promise had taken hits in both wings and the tail section. The ball turret gunner was dead. Tom the navigator was unconscious, a piece of flak embedded in his skull. Target in sight! Sal called. Doors open! The flak was biblical. The sky turned black with explosions. A bomber directly ahead took a hit in the bomb bay, exploded so close that Ellie's promise flew through the debris field. Metal screamed. Alarm shrieked. Number 3 engine caught fire. Feather 3! Fire suppression! It's not working! Fire's spreading! Jimmy had seconds to decide. Abort and they'd be torn apart by fighters. Continue and the fire might reach the fuel tanks. He chose to continue. Bombs away! They dropped their payload and banked hard, fighting through the flak, the fire in number 3 engine now spreading to the wing. Jimmy pushed the yoke forward, trading altitude for speed, racing ahead of the formation, trying to get clear before the wing exploded. Everything went weightless. The B-17 snap-rolled, tearing itself apart. Jimmy fought the controls, but there were no controls, just dead sticks and screaming metal. Through the chaos, he saw Mickey pulling the bailout alarm, saw Sal scrambling up from the bombardier's position. Bail out! Bail out! Jimmy's voice barely audible over the wind roaring through the shattered cockpit. He saw Mickey go out the top hatch. Saw Sal tumble through the nose wheel well. Couldn't see what happened to the gunners in back, didn't know if they made it out. The ground spiraled closer. Jimmy reached for the hatch release, but his harness was jammed, the buckle bent from impact. He yanked at it desperately, the ground filling his vision. 3,000 feet. 2,000. 1000. The buckle released. Jimmy dove through the hatch into screaming wind. Pulled the ripcord. The parachute deployed with a bone-jarring snap. Then he was floating, watching Ellie's promise cartwheel into a forest and explode, watching the sky above fill with hundreds of parachutes as the raid fell apart. He hit the ground hard, rolled, came up tangled in shroud lines. For a long moment, he just lay there, unable to process that he was alive. Then he heard voices. German voices. Jimmy ran. The next 3 days were a nightmare of hiding and moving, stealing food from farms, navigating by the stars. He memorized the escape routes during training: head west, avoid cities, find the resistance. He had no idea if any of his crew survived. No idea how many bombers made it home. On the 4th day, weak from hunger and fighting infection from a shrapnel wound in his leg, Jimmy collapsed in a barn outside a small village. He woke to a rifle barrel in his face and a middle-aged French farmer staring at him with hard eyes. "American?" the farmer asked in heavily accented English. "Yes." "Lieutenant James Holloway, 351st Bomb Group." The farmer studied him for a long moment, then lowered the rifle. "You are lucky. Germans were here yesterday, searching for pilots. Come. My wife will feed you. Then we take you to friends who can help." The French resistance was a shadowy network of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. They moved Jimmy from safe house to safe house, each stop a risk that could get everyone killed. He met farmers and teachers and priests, all united in their hatred of the occupation. They asked nothing except that he remember them after the war. It took 6 weeks to reach the Spanish border. 6 weeks of close calls and near misses. 6 weeks of wondering if Ellie thought he was dead. Of wondering if he'd ever see her again. The Pyrenees crossing was brutal. Jimmy and 3 other evading airmen were led by a Basque guide up frozen mountain passes, through terrain that killed as surely as bullets. One of the airmen, a ball turret gunner from Wisconsin, fell during a night climb, tumbling into a ravine. They couldn't even recover his body. Spain was neutral but tense. British intelligence operatives smuggled them to Gibraltar, then put them on a ship to England. When Jimmy finally set foot on British soil again, he'd lost 30 pounds and gained a 1,000-yard stare. The first thing he did was call the Red Cross station in London. "I need to speak with Eleanor Brennan. It's urgent." "I'm sorry, sir. Nurse Brennan is no longer stationed here." Jimmy's world tilted. "Where is she?" "I'm not authorized to." "I'm Lieutenant James Holloway, 351st Bomb Group. I was shot down over Germany 8 weeks ago. Eleanor Brennan is..." His voice broke. "Please. I need to know where she is." A long pause. "She volunteered for forward deployment 3 weeks ago, sir. She's with the field hospitals following the advance into France." It took Jimmy another week to get permission to travel to France. Officially, he was supposed to report back to his squadron for reassignment. Unofficially, he told his commanding officer he was going to find Ellie or die trying, and if that meant being court-martialed, so be it. The CO, a grizzled major who'd flown in the First World War, just nodded. "You've got 72 hours. After that, I have to report you AWOL. Make them count, son." Jimmy hitched rides on cargo planes and supply trucks, following the advancing Allied armies deeper into France. The countryside was a devastated moonscape: burned-out tanks, shattered villages, hastily dug graves. The war was everywhere and nowhere, a sprawling chaos that swallowed everything. He found the field hospital outside Verdun, a cluster of tents and makeshift buildings surrounded by barbed wire and mud. Wounded men lay on stretchers waiting for treatment. Ambulances came and went in a constant stream. The air reeked of blood and antiseptic and death. "I'm looking for Eleanor Brennan," Jimmy told the first nurse he saw. "Surgical tent, but you can't." Jimmy was already moving, limping on his half-healed leg, pushing through the organized chaos. He found the surgical tent by following the sounds of screaming. Inside, doctors and nurses worked under harsh electric lights, surrounded by buckets of bloody bandages and men with wounds that defied description. And there she was. Ellie stood at an operating table, handing instruments to a surgeon, her uniform stained with blood, her face drawn with exhaustion. She looked up as he entered, and for a moment didn't recognize him. Then her eyes went wide. "Jimmy?" The instrument clattered to the floor. She crossed the tent in 3 strides and threw her arms around him, not caring about the blood, not caring about protocol, just holding him like she'd never let go. "They said you were dead," she whispered against his chest. "Your plane went down. No parachutes sighted. They said, I'm here. I'm alive. I found you." They stood there in the middle of the surgical tent, holding each other while the war raged on around them. A doctor cleared his throat pointedly. Ellie pulled back, wiping her eyes. "I need to finish this surgery. Wait for me outside. Please. Don't disappear again. I'm not going anywhere." He waited in the cold November air, watching the wounded arrive, watching the dead being carried away. This close to the front, the illusion of war as something noble or glorious was completely shattered. It was just meat and metal and mud. Ellie emerged 2 hours later, still in her surgical scrubs, blood smeared on her forearms. She looked like she hadn't slept in days. "There's a supply tent around back where we can talk," she said. They found privacy among crates of bandages and morphine. For a long moment, they just looked at each other, relearning faces that had lived only in memory. "Tell me," Ellie said finally. "All of it." So Jimmy told her. About Bremen and Schweinfurt, about the crew he'd lost, about Mickey's last salute as Ellie's promise broke apart. About the bailout and the long walk through occupied France, the resistance fighters who'd risked everything to save a stranger. About the mountains and the cold and the certainty that he'd never see her again. When he finished, Ellie was crying silently, tears cutting tracks through the grime on her cheeks. "I volunteered for this posting because I couldn't stand London anymore," she said. "Every day you didn't come back, every day they posted the casualty lists. I needed to do something that felt like I was fighting. Like I could make a difference." She laughed bitterly. "Turns out here, I'm just trying to hold men together long enough for them to go back and get shot again. You're keeping them alive. That's everything. Is it?" She met his eyes. "Sometimes I think we're just prolonging the dying. Sometimes I wonder if any of this matters." Jimmy took her hands. They were cold and trembling. "It matters because we matter. You and me and everyone trying to survive this. After the war. Don't." She pulled away. "Don't talk about after the war. We're not going to make it to after the war, Jimmy. Look around. This doesn't end. It just keeps grinding up lives until there's nothing left. Then we'll make it end. We'll survive out of pure spite if we have to. You almost didn't survive. And I'm here at the front where a shell could land on this hospital any minute. We're living on borrowed time. Then let's not waste it." Jimmy pulled her close again. "I love you, Ellie Brennan. I came back from the dead to tell you that. I'll keep coming back, no matter what, until this war ends and we can have the life we talked about." She looked up at him, and he saw the moment she decided to believe. To hope. To fight. "I love you too, flyboy. And when this is over, you're buying me that bookshop. Deal." They kissed in a supply tent in the middle of a war zone, surrounded by the tools of saving lives and the constant reminder of death. And somehow, impossibly, it was perfect. Jimmy was ordered back to England the next morning. He argued, pled, threatened, but orders were orders. He had 3 more months of his tour, 30 more missions. The odds of surviving them were statistically insignificant. He and Ellie spent their last night together in a bombed-out church outside the hospital compound. The roof was gone, exposing the stars, but 3 walls still stood. They made a nest of blankets and held each other while artillery rumbled in the distance. "Promise me again," Ellie said. "Promise you'll come back." "I promise. I'll finish my tour, come back to you, and we'll go home together. I'm holding you to that, Lieutenant." They made love under the stars, slow and desperate and achingly tender. Every touch was a declaration. Every kiss was a promise. They were 2 people trying to carve something beautiful out of hell. At dawn, Jimmy kissed her goodbye and climbed into a supply truck headed for the coast. He watched through the back canvas until the hospital disappeared behind a hill, then sat in silence for the 12-hour drive, memorizing the feeling of her in his arms. His new plane wasn't called Ellie's Promise. The superstition seemed wrong now, tempting fate. They called it Second Chance, and Jimmy flew it like every mission might be his last. Berlin. Munich. Hamburg. The raids got bigger, the targets deeper. The Germans were losing, everyone knew it, but they fought with the desperation of the doomed. Every mission was a bloodbath. Jimmy's crew rotated constantly, men killed, men wounded, men who simply couldn't face it anymore. On his 48th mission, 3 short of finishing his tour, they hit a synthetic oil plant outside Dresden. The flak was the worst he'd ever seen. Second Chance took hits in 3 engines, lost hydraulics, barely limped back across the channel. They crash-landed at the first airfield they reached, the plane breaking apart on impact. Jimmy dragged his wounded bombardier from the wreckage minutes before the fuel tanks exploded. They both survived with minor injuries. That night, lying in the infirmary, Jimmy decided he was done tempting fate. He requested a transfer to non-combat duty. His CO approved it immediately. "You've done enough, Lieutenant. More than enough. Go find your nurse." The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. Jimmy was in Paris when the news came, processing discharge papers for returning POWs. He heard the church bells first, then the sirens, then the shouting. People poured into the streets, crying and laughing and dancing. It was over. He found Ellie 2 days later at a hospital in Reims. She was sitting outside the building, still in her uniform, staring at nothing. He sat down beside her. "Hey!" She turned, and the smile that lit her face was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. "Hey yourself, fly boy. I heard there's this bookshop in Boston that might be for sale." "Really? That's interesting. I heard there's an aircraft company in California looking for engineers. Sounds like we might be able to work something out." "Sounds like." They sat in silence, shoulders touching, watching the celebration happening around them. The war was over, but the scars would last forever. They'd both seen too much, lost too much, carried too much darkness. But they'd survived. Together, they'd found light in the ashes. Ellie stood, offered her hand. "Take me home, Jimmy." He took her hand and stood. "Which home? Boston or California? Doesn't matter. Wherever you are is home." They walked into the crowd, 2 Americans among thousands, no longer fighting a war, finally able to start fighting for a life. Behind them, the hospital stood silent. Ahead, the future beckoned, uncertain but possible. They'd made each other a promise in the darkness. Now, in the light, they'd keep it. Together. Jimmy and Ellie married in Boston 6 months later, in the same church where her brother Sean's memorial service had been held. Tommy and Patrick stood as groomsmen, both homes safe. Ellie's parents wept through the ceremony. They spent their honeymoon in Santa Monica, walking the same beaches Jimmy had explored as a child. Then they settled in a compromise, a small town in Connecticut, halfway between her family and his dreams. Jimmy designed aircraft for a civilian company, revolutionary planes that made flying safer for everyone. Ellie opened her bookshop, a cozy space that became the town's heart. They had 3 children, told them carefully edited stories about the war, taught them the value of peace. On quiet nights, they'd sit on their porch and remember. The fear. The loss. The darkness. But mostly they remembered the love they'd found in the middle of it all. The promise they'd made to each other. The promise they'd kept. Love, forged in the ashes of war, built to last a lifetime.